Well, hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. This is NEAAPOR Spring Webinar, a New England Perspectives on the upcoming midterm elections. My name is Patrick Madden, president of NEAAPOR, and again, welcome today. I'm super excited about today's discussion. We have a great panel, and of course, probably one of the more anticipated midterm elections coming up in the fall. Our discussion today will cover some of the exciting races going on around New England, as well as some other key factors that will have an impact this fall. So our panel today includes Spencer Kimball, Assistant Professor and Director of Emerson College Polling, Andy Smith, Associate Professor and Director of the UNH Survey Center, Joe Lenski, Executive Vice President at SSRS, and our moderator for the discussion is Emma Platnoff, Political Enterprise Reporter for the Boston Globe. Our panel discussion will run maybe about 30 to 35 minutes, and we'll make sure to leave time at the end for Q&A. So feel free to submit any questions you have via the chat at any time during the webinar. And with that, I'll hang things off to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you all for joining us here on Marathon Monday in Boston. Really great to have such a good panel here to talk about some of the most anticipated races of this fall. I want to get into state by state, but maybe Andy, if you don't mind just kicking us off with sort of a broad perspective. This is a midterm election year. You know, we have a very controversial president in the White House. What is the general trend you're anticipating, particularly as we look at sort of Democrats versus Republicans across New England? Is there sort of an overarching message we should start off with?
I think the overarching message is going to be very, very difficult for Republicans to win much this year. First off, the New England states are more Democratic than many other parts of the country, with the possible exceptions of New Hampshire and Maine, slightly balanced. So I think the thing and Trump is very unpopular across all of the New England states. I think the thing that's going to be most interesting is to see who Democrats are able to get through the primaries. And I think that's really where the exciting races are going to be in the state primaries.
Yeah, well, let's start with one of the races I'm personally most fascinated by. This is the U.S. Senate contest in Maine. Starting with the Democratic primary, where a lot of the energy and excitement is right now. Joe, I want to start with you on this. Just to give us a rundown, you know, a few months ago, this race was dominated by unflattering reports about Democratic candidate Graham Plattner, his tattoos that resemble Nazi symbolism, some of the controversial comments he's made about rape online, on online forums. A lot of people thought he was done for with that unflattering reporting. Now he seems to be surging ahead. How did we get here?
Well, I think we've reached an environment where it takes a lot more controversy to take a candidate out than before. And we're also in an environment on the Democratic side where maybe being 70 or 80 years old is more of a negative than what your social media presence was 10 or 15 years ago. I think in the post-Biden era, we're seeing nationally kind of a rejection among a good chunk of Democratic primary voters of older established candidates. And I think that might be a bigger problem for Mills than the fact that Plattner has some, uncomfortable past on social media.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Spencer, what can you tell us about voter enthusiasm in Maine? Are people sort of backing Graham Plattner with their whole noses held? Are they genuinely excited to support him?
Well, you can see at the rallies, Plattner gets a full house there. He brings in Senator Elizabeth Warren. So when you start looking at like the Bernie Bros and his Bernie endorsement, having Warren on his team helps balance that off, particularly against Janet Mills, who's an older female candidate that Warren could try to pull some vote, affinity away from her and bring it over. But the Mills people really think that she can win. And so they're very vested in her, but our polling has her down, considerably. But when we look in that polling, we see that the Mills people really don't like Plattner. And so the question is, at the end of the day, if those numbers hold, will the Mills people move over to Plattner, or do they find a natural affinity with Susan Collins and move over into that camp? And Plattner is winning the general election hypotheticals, but he's not over 50%. So that creates a space for Collins to be able to close like she did back in 2020. But we'll see if she can catch lightning in a bottle a second time.
Yeah.
To that point, I think that's really going to be the interesting thing, because we saw Plattner up as late as October last year with almost 60% of the primary vote. And despite what happened with the tattoos and so forth, which I should say that information was leaked to the press by the Mills campaign, they went after him negative very early, maybe too early. So he's up to 64%. So he did better with that. And against Collins, Plattner does better than Mills does, not by a huge amount. It'll probably come down to party ID, but to Spencer's point, it's going to be the motivation of people. And if you had to rely on one group of voters, I think the older voters that Mills has are going to be more reliable than a lot of the younger voters that Plattner seems to have energized in this race.
Yeah, I want to take maybe one more beat to drill down on those demographics. Platter has really presented himself as kind of a blue collar working class hero. Are those where, is that where he's drawing his votes from as well?
Given where he is, he's drawing his vote across a wide spectrum of the Democratic Party, and I think that's the biggest problem for Mills. Mills is not unpopular among Democrats. I mean, her favorability ratings, she's at 51% favorable, 20% unfavorable. The problem is that Plattner is much higher. He's at 71% favorable, 11% unfavorable. So he's the more broadly accepted candidate right now, which is where Mills tried to position herself going into this race.
Yeah, and we haven't seen this in Democratic primaries right here in New Jersey, where I am in New Jersey 11. We had a special election to replace Mikey Sherrill, and a former congressman, moderate congressman, Tom Malinowski, was outpolled by an AOC acolyte endorsed by Bernie Sanders here in suburban New Jersey. And what drove that was relatively rich suburban areas like Morris County, where she did even better than expected. So I think the kind of AOC Bernie supported candidates in Democratic primaries have more support than you'd think, even in wealthier suburban areas.
Yeah, and Joe, you raised the question early on about age, right? Especially in the 2024 race with President Joe Biden, this has been a real question for Democratic primaries. I want to put a question to the three of you. So in Maine, obviously, we see this younger, sort of less establishment, progressive-backed candidate surging ahead over his much decades older opponent in Janet Mills. Here in Massachusetts, we see the opposite trend, right? Our recent Globe Suffolk University poll had Ed Markey well ahead of Seth Moulton, who's his junior by many decades and has really been trying to make this a race about generational change. So what to you explains that difference there? I mean, is it clearly what other than age is influencing our voters here?
Well, I saw Markey turn his messaging around back when he faced Joe Kennedy, in his last election. He became very progressive, and I would listen to his speeches. I'm like, wow, we got Bernie Sanders here in Massachusetts. And boom, this older person became the progressive candidate, and my students were attracted to his campaign, not to Joe Kennedy's campaign. And so it's not necessarily the age at that time. However, I do think that the circumstances has shifted a little bit on the age issue with Joe Biden's candidacy in 24. And that has created a little concern for voters, particularly on the left, if they're going to nominate someone who's not up to the challenge. But we see it here. Markey, he does have a good lead. It's not as Plattner's, though, from what I'm seeing. So there is still a little hesitation, even within the Democrats in Massachusetts, on that age issue. But Plattner definitely has younger voters. The Bernie group is still organized to the point where they can get out that vote. And each race, though, has its own little stories. And that's kind of the difference there.
And I think to follow up, Spencer, your point is that Moulton is running at the wrong time to be a moderate to conservative Democrat. That's usually the way you want to go with some of these things. But this time around, I think the Democratic Party, particularly more highly educated Democrats, have really given up on the idea that we have to put somebody who's in the middle, who can be acceptable to a general election audience. And they're really going for the AOC wing, as Joe points out, in New Jersey just recently, or Mamdani in New York City. And Moulton is not that. If anything, he would be maybe a a moderate Republican in Massachusetts by the ideological standards. And we're seeing that he is just not drawing support from those more progressive wings of the party that he would have to in order to beat Markey, similar to what Plattner is doing in Maine.
Yeah, I don't think you can underestimate Markey because he figured it out 6 years ago and survived that Kennedy challenge. So he obviously is a little more sure-footed than a lot of these older, moderate establishment Democrats just haven't been challenged in a primary before, and that's usually when they're caught by surprise.
Right, right. And I think establishment is a huge part of this, right? I mean, we're sort of talking about not just the age dynamic, but there's a big ideology dynamic here. It seems to me in a lot of these races. Um, Traditionally you'd probably be pretty happy to have the leader of the Democratic establishment in Chuck Schumer coming to your aid, right? If you're in a contested race. Not this year.
No.
Can you talk about the role of those national figures, particularly in Maine and beyond?
Well, Schumer's approval rating is terrible. So like that's not someone you want to be attracted to if you're a Democrat. And you can see Julia Stanton in Illinois, she rejected Schumer, said I wouldn't vote for Schumer. You're seeing it as a campaign issue for Senate Democrats who are running, who could take over the Senate, saying I wouldn't go with Schumer as an issue. So it is something about being on the outside. That's why, like, I look at the Sherrod Brown race in Ohio, saying, "Hey, the Dems put up a traditional candidate again. Let's see how that works." Because it seems like America is more for a new candidate. They want the Mamdani. They want somebody fresh who can deliver at least new ideas. We'll see what they deliver in practice. So it's interesting to see it all kind of play out. I would add one more thing with Moulton is that he had a different run when he beat Tierney, the incumbent. And I know people have talked about that he knocked off an incumbent here in Massachusetts. Tierney had a lot of baggage. I don't think Markey has anything close to that level of baggage because it takes two to tango in that situation. So he's got to give voters a reason not to vote for Markey. He had that for Tierney, and we'll see what that messaging looks like. But yeah, we're going to see the new blood coming in, particularly on the left.
The other thing, the New England primaries tend to be later. Massachusetts isn't until September. I mean, you may see a drumbeat nationally if older establishment moderate Democrats start getting defeated in these primaries. That becomes a national story, and the national press starts looking for more examples for that. So I think if we see that pattern hold true in the primaries that are coming up in May, June, and August, that may have some influence in what we see in Massachusetts in September.
To amplify on that, we have to remember and couch all of this race in terms of the voters aren't really paying attention yet. Mm-hmm. In Maine, you're seeing a lot of people coming out to events for Plattner, but and the primary there is in early June. But the other states with late primaries, there's just not much campaigning going on just among the insiders. People are looking for some support and frankly labor, but they're really not energizing or even trying to energize the actual general election voters yet.
Yeah, yeah. I do just to stay with Maine for one more beat. I mean, this is maybe one of the most exciting or only exciting general election races in our region. Susan Collins, certainly not the new candidate, we've described as the profile many voters are looking for. She has some of the lowest approval ratings of any sitting U.S. senator. Does it matter? Is this a rehabilitation campaign for her?
She's done it before, and it's usually because the Democratic candidate collapses. I don't think it's going to be a favorable year for her to be able to pull that off this time around. In a midterm election, Republicans are hesitantly supporting her. They're not enthusiastic about her, but they're rallying around her. If you looked at this race 2 years ago, I would have said she is done because Republicans were really angry with her coming off from the 2000. Even as recent as 2004 with the election of Trump, the MAGA Democrats or MAGA Republicans, which is what Maine voters really are, the Republican voters are the blue collar voters. It's not the country club Republicans anymore. They were really unhappy with Susan Collins, but now they're coming around to her. The problem is there's just not a lot of enthusiasm among that group.
Mm-hmm.
And even her success 6 years ago is probably a little overstated because of the ranked choice voting option in Maine. She only received about 51% of the vote last time. And if ranked choice voting had come into play, her 9-point lead in first choice voting probably would have been narrowed to 5 or 6 points if the ranked choice voting had come into play. So I think it's going to be really tough for her to get to 50% in the first round, and then ranked choice voting is a complication, and usually that favors Democratic candidates in the subsequent ranked choice voting round. So I think that's another complication for her.
Yeah, how much do we expect ranked choice voting to play a role in this year's Senate race? I know maybe in the governor's race in Maine, we may see that emerge more as a trend. Is that something you're keeping an eye on, or hard to say at this point?
Well, it can't happen in the governor's race because the governor's race is the one race in Maine which is prohibited from having ranked choice voting in the Constitution. It says
Right,
the
right.
candidate with the most votes wins. And Maine
Even though that was the reason why they put in the law.
to get rid of the guy who's running in the second district, Paul LePage.
Where it may come full circle.
There it might help. I think that LePage may even be able to win that seat. Possibly, it's going to be harder for any Republican to win that seat this time around. But there would be kind of a fun story to write about if LePage, who was the guy that was going to be killed by ranked choice voting, actually wins by ranked choice voting.
Plenty of historical ironies in our New England politics, I think. I want to shift gears over to New Hampshire, where we have a rare open seat after Jeanne Shaheen's, exit this year. On the Republican side, we have two candidates who've seen the U.S. Senate before. Of course, John Sununu, part of the powerful political dynasty in New Hampshire, and Scott Brown, who represented Massachusetts in the U.S. Senate. Also a familiar face in Chris Pappas on the Democratic side, looking to jump from the House to the Senate. Um, Spencer, can anyone beat the name Sununu in New Hampshire?
Maybe Chris Pappas. So, yeah, I mean, Sununu's not, inevitable, but he is definitely going to be a strong candidate. I think Scott Brown's got a real tough time coming out of the Republican primary. He kind of had his one shot in New Hampshire. His wife had a shot, didn't really work out. So we'll see where that one goes. But no, the general election there is competitive, and that's one of 3 seats that I think the Republicans are looking at. They're looking at Georgia, Michigan, and New Hampshire. And to Andy's point, I agree, in a Democratic swing year where these are going to be tough pickup opportunities. But it does come down state to state. When you have Kelly Ayotte as the incumbent governor, we'll see where the Democrats go in their camp. But yeah, we definitely have a varsity race here in New Hampshire for Senate.
Yeah, Sununu's he's done a good job and beating Jeanne Shaheen first in 2002, but losing to her in 2008. He stayed out of the limelight for a long time, but his brother is extremely popular. And one of the things that he may have to help him out is that there are still a lot of people in New Hampshire that will think that he may be the same guy as Chris Sununu, who they did like. One of the things about New Hampshire that makes it kind of tricky to look at is about every 8 years, a third of our potential voters are different people. Either they weren't old enough to vote 8 years ago, or they didn't live in the state 8 years ago. So going by historical trends in New Hampshire is somewhat dicey. What we'd seen over the previous years that the new voters in New Hampshire tended to lean Democratic, more so than Republican, more than the people that they were replacing. That's shifted around a little bit over the last 6 years or so. So it's more balanced, but this is still a race that I think Sununu, I'm presuming that he's going to win the primary. He's going to have more money. He's got more campaign organization, more strength within the state party, but still for him to be able to motivate Republicans is going to be a challenge because Republicans still aren't that enthusiastic about Kelly Ayotte, who she lost arguably her race for her for re-election back in 2016 because she wasn't all on board with Donald Trump in that year.
Andy, because of that movement of people in New Hampshire, do you think the national wave might have more effect in New Hampshire? I'm just thinking, like, if Trump can get his numbers back up to the mid 40s, I think that would put states like New Hampshire and, as mentioned earlier, Georgia, Michigan, Maine in play. But if Trump's approval numbers nationally stay in the low 30s, I think the Senate battleground is going to move to those Republican states like Ohio and Texas and Alaska and Iowa that are going to make the balance of power in the Senate. So I think a lot of whether New Hampshire is competitive or not at the Senate level is whether the Trump approval is still in the low 30s or he can get it back up to the mid 40s.
I agree. I think that the big turnout push, which is really the case in all of these things, is the battlegrounds are moving away from any Republican pickups to Democratic pickups in states that they haven't held in a long time, like Ohio.
Andy, I want to go back to a point you made about Governor Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire. We know that she's navigating Donald Trump is a really tricky thing for any Republican, but particularly for Republicans here in New England, right, where he's particularly unpopular. Some of the Republicans here are a little bit more moderate. We saw her kind of misstep on that, make a political mistake almost a decade ago now. How do you think her handling of the proposed ICE facility in Merrimack might affect her electoral chances this year? Did she thread the needle there in sort of staving off the building of a new ICE detention facility in Merrimack? Or are there going to be those on the right who are unhappy with her for not sort of welcoming that part of Trump's agenda into her state?
I don't think it's going to make much difference one way or the other by the time the primary comes around in September. That's going to be long forgotten, and there's going to be a half a dozen or a dozen more Trumpy issues that are going to come up in between times. So, for a short-term thing, I think she did a good job of avoiding that as a major issue. But long-term, I don't think it's going to be anywhere as a issue that people are going to decide to support her or not because of that. The biggest issue she's got is that she's just never had that honeymoon uh, after being elected governor 2 years ago. Her job approval rating is 47% approve, 47% disapprove right now, which, as an incumbent Republican in New Hampshire, is going to put you in a difficult position. She's even less popular now than Craig Benson was going into the 2024 election, which he lost very narrowly. So I wouldn't be putting too much money on her being because she's an incumbent. It's just going to be a bad year for Republicans. My sense is up here, Republicans will very likely lose the state house and could very well lose the state senate. They're both kind of gerrymandered for different reasons, but it takes about 54% of the vote for Democrats to win majorities in either of those bodies. They could get 54% of the vote this year.
How does that fare in the governor's race where we haven't really yet seen a Democrat take fire against Kelly Ayotte? Do you think there's still time for that to shift?
I think that's the biggest hope that Kelly Ayotte has. She got that in 2004, where the mayor, the former mayor of Manchester, ran against her and ran a lackluster campaign. And the major candidate who's running this year, Cindy Warmington, who's an executive council member, is as bland as and I'm blanking on the mayor, Joyce Craig. She's as bland as Joyce Craig. But that New Hampshire Democrats have chosen kind of I would say uninspiring women candidates, but bland women candidates, going back to Jean Shaheen and Maggie Hassan, and the other candidates they put up are not the kind of firebrands that seem to be motivating Democrats this cycle.
One of my favorite or most interesting New Hampshire electoral phenomenons is just the number of ticket splitters. Spencer, can you talk a little bit about this phenomenon? I mean, we could very well see Kelly Ayotte, despite these kind of dismal approval ratings that you're describing, we could still see her win re-election, even as, say, Chris Pappas is elected to the Senate statewide on the Democratic side. How do you think about these folks who may vote for a Republican and then vote for a Democrat in the next breath?
Yeah, no, that you're exactly right. So Ayotte probably won by 9 points or so last time, and uh, Harris wins the state by 6. So you can see 15-point swing of voters that would vote one way for the president, another way for governor. And I think that's the independence of New Hampshire. Some of the argument of why they're first in the nation in the primaries is that they are independent. They not lock in with one candidate. With that said, I always find that the governor's race every 2 years, the perpetual governor's race is interesting situation in Vermont and New Hampshire. A little bit unique to what happens up there. But even the number of registered voters as Democrats and Republicans has been dwindling as independents has risen. They're probably over 40% at this point in the state, a plurality. So we are seeing that shift. But the ticket splitting, I think, is important. And it's good to see. New Hampshire is one of the states that is probably stronger in it than many others.
I should make one point about this, and I get in trouble here by saying this in New Hampshire, is we're really not that independent of a state. Those people who are registered undeclared, which is the official title, most of them are either Democrats or Republicans. Only about 15% are truly independent, and they generally don't vote that much except within a presidential election. And it's similar in Massachusetts. You've got the, what is it, unenrolled or unaffiliated down in Massachusetts make up about 55% of your voters, but we don't see Massachusetts as an independent state very much. So I'm always cautious to say that those voters are there. The biggest issue is that with the governors in New Hampshire, and I think this is true across the country, they're like their own little enterprise, not affiliated with the national party. And I think Chris Sununu has demonstrated that here in New Hampshire. You've seen Massachusetts elect a number of Republican governors in a very Democratic state. Phil Scott in Vermont, Larry Hogan in Maryland, where governors, if they were able to demonstrate capability of managing the state as an organization, they kind of are not evaluated as much by their partisanship as other candidates are.
But I
Right, and
just point out that New Hampshire is much more Republican than Massachusetts. We're like 5% registered. New Hampshire's got to be closer to 30, 32.
30, yeah.
So that's why there's not a competitive really Senate race here in Mass with Markey and whoever the Republic ends up being. But in New Hampshire, it is competitive because they do have more organization in that state. And that's an interesting part of New England, is that the Republican Party is kind of spread out. You have the second district of Maine, but not the first district. So where they get their votes from is going to be important, obviously, in the midterms, but moving on to the 28 election as well.
Yeah. Joe, from a national perspective, how much are people really watching New England this cycle?
Except for Maine, I don't think nationally it's going to register much at all. I think as Andy said earlier, you have every House member in New England currently is Democratic. Every governor, with the exception of Phil Scott, is Democratic. So, well, yeah, in the last election, Kelly Ayotte was in. But I think from a national point of view, again, depending on where the Trump approval rating is and where the battleground is and where the money is going to be spent, I think the parties are going to look at the states that are going to tip control of the Senate. And there's typically 5 states Senate races where the margin is 4 points or less, and the national campaigns will know where those 5 states are going down to the wire. And if it's an environment where Trump's approval is in the mid 40s, those states might include Maine and New Hampshire. But if Trump is at 37%, where the latest NBC poll was yesterday, or in the 30s, where the latest YouGov poll had them, then the battleground states for the Senate are going to be Ohio and Iowa and Texas and Alaska, and that's where the money is going to be spent by the national parties, and that's where the national interest is going to be.
Yeah. Just a reminder, we'll do a few more minutes here, but I'd love for folks to submit their questions in the chat if you have any questions for our experts here. Staying with Trump for a minute there. The biggest story internationally right now is of course the Iran war. How does that play in the races here? Is it too early to say?
We're seeing that it's very unpopular across the New England states that we've polled in, not surprisingly, because of the Democratic aspect of the states. But I've given up on seeing what the influence of something Trump does 6 months or 8 months before an election is going to have on the election, because there's going to be 10 more things that he does between now and then that are going to be as controversial as even going into battle against Iran.
Yeah, but usually with a foreign conflict, you see, at least at the beginning, its approval being higher than presidential approval. That did not happen with this case at all. And I think that makes it unique. And I think it makes it harder, even if Trump wants to trumpet a successful conclusion from his point of view. It's never been popular, and it's probably not going to end up more popular than it is right now, especially if gas prices and fuel oil prices remain high and come down slowly. And the other part of this, and I think it has some effect in New England because of the Catholic population, this battle with the Pope, which is completely from Trump's initiation, I don't see how that helps with Catholic voters, and there's plenty of those in New England.
Yeah, I would just double down and agree. I don't know where the Pope argument's going to fit in all of the problems out there with Trump. But the question before that, Emma, what were we? You got me distracted, Joe, with the Pope.
Well, he does have higher approval ratings than Trump.
Well, back to the Iran war. It's
Right.
the So the Democrats are going to come out and protest the war. It's like 80-10, 90-10. Democrats hate the war. The Republicans are like a little bit cool, warmer to it. It's like 80-20 that they like the war. It's the independents that are like 2-1 against the war.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about turnout, I don't see any rallies for the war. I see really rallies against the war. And that's the energy that the Democrats are going to use to get that +6 or the +9 that we're seeing in the generic vote. So if they have that number, all of those states that were within 6 points or 9 points now come into play. And that's what we're seeing. And I'm not sure what issue, because to Andy's point, it's hard to predict what's going to be the issue we're going to talk about in 6 months. But if these are the issues that are on the table, I think the Democrats are in a good place to be able to exploit them to help get out their vote. And even on the Catholic issue with the Pope, that's only going to hold back potential vote that I would see. It's hard to imagine that rallying around. Now, the base will like it, but the independents, and that's the swing vote, they don't seem to buy into what the president is selling.
I think Donald Trump is the Democratic Party's superpower this go around.
If you're someone like Susan Collins, I mean, what's your play in this moment? How far can you distance yourself from this war and the spike in gas prices that it's caused without alienating the voters you need on the right?
Well, her biggest problem isn't so much alienating them as having their motivation, their intensity go down, which isn't that high to begin with. Maine Republicans now are blue-collar Republicans. They are not the old New England Rockefeller Republicans. It's the blue-collar voters who are less likely to vote than our other people. And I just don't see that anything that Trump is doing right now is really motivating those people. And seeing gas prices up, I mean, if you look in Maine, you see the Republicans, those are the guys with the pickup trucks with the toolbox in back, and they're burning through gas at 12 miles a gallon or so in those trucks. They're not real happy right now.
Right. I want to ask about affordability. I mean, even given how hard it is to predict so far out what a key issue for any election will be, I mean, this is one that is not going away, right? And I think in 2024, it's an issue that Trump used to his own advantage. He sort of won the economics argument and was able to defeat Kamala Harris for that reason. Is this an issue that's on the Democrats' side this time? Questions around affordability, the housing crisis here in New England, gas prices in particular?
Absolutely. I think an old wag told me that rationalization is the second strongest human drive. And now Democrats are going to be able to rationalize to themselves why the affordability is Trump's problem, and Republicans aren't going to be able to have a good counter argument for that because it's his issue now. It's that pile of whatever is in his lap.
Yeah, I would say the tariffs made him own it from the beginning, and now he's got to deal with not just affordability, and that's going to be a big issue up here, but we've got healthcare as a big issue that's percolating up there, even threats to democracy. But to your point, like when we look at California, it's all about affordability and economic concerns, 60% of voters. So that is going to be a big issue. And to Andy's point, it feels like Trump was able to make the argument 3 months ago that gas prices were lower. Well, that argument's gone. So where are the arguments where Republicans can make to show that the economy is on the right track? We'll see what happens in 6 months. But what we're seeing in April is it looks like it's heading in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I think for 26, it's all on Trump with the economy, and you can see now his ratings on controlling inflation and the economy in general are even lower now than his overall job approval ratings, and that's a tough place for him to be. I mean, the Democrats, I think for 26 can probably get away without a specific plan to address these issues. I think that's going to be more front and center in 2028 when individual presidential candidates are trying to distinguish themselves. But I think for 26, as long as the Democrats can keep it as a referendum on the Trump economy, that's their ticket to gaining control of the House and maybe the Senate this fall.
Absolutely. Well, I want to go to audience questions in just a minute, but we don't want to skip the small but fascinating state of Rhode Island, where we have a really interesting Democratic primary for the governor's race this year. Dan McKee has been really facing an uphill battle here. Is this about an anti-incumbency argument, or is there something more?
Uh, we've been doing polling on this for a while, and his job approval rating going back to 2024 was only 26%. It's down to 18% in our most recent polls. Democrats don't like him in the state. And it really comes down to that competency of the governor. He's saddled with a unfortunate, disastrous bridge construction project in the center of the state that is just wreaking havoc still on what's going on. As soon as that bridge project went downhill, his approval ratings went with it, and he is getting no credit for anything else. He may be the only place where bringing in Chuck Schumer might be a more positive guy than McKee. So that's a real trouble. And I think Helena Folks, who's former CEO of what was it, the CVS, but she's running against him. And I think she's got a really good chance of knocking him off. If she wins the primary, she's going to be the next governor.
And she came pretty close last time. So it's
Yes.
not like she had much ground, and it was a multi-candidate field. So, I mean, I think McKee won that primary in the low 30s in that. So he didn't even start off with much of a base to begin with. This idea of bridge construction projects affecting the opinion of competence of governors, this happens all over the place. I mean, in Pennsylvania, there was a big truck fire that took out I-95, and Governor Josh Shapiro came right in and says, "I'm getting shit done, and I'm going to get this bridge, this highway fixed," and he got it fixed within 2 weeks. In Baltimore, they had that bridge collapse when the ship hit it, and that bridge still isn't being rebuilt. And I think that's taken some luster out of the Wes Moore campaign. So taking charge of infrastructure issues like that, I think, is a big job for the governor, and I think it really does affect their ratings.
In that primary, as we mentioned, it's a rematch. We have a huge chunk of the Democratic electorate still undecided. What do you think they're waiting for, Spencer? What should we watch for there?
I'm probably waiting for summer. I think the Rhode
To
Island
pay
primary.
attention.
Yeah, this is not like New England. We like to have them in September. So I think Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Mass, we're all, I think, around Labor Day. Or post Labor Day. So they're gonna start focusing in. But the issue is in New York City, Mamdani had a snowstorm and people thought he did a good job. And so boom, his approval goes a little bit higher. Here, they're building something. They don't think he's doing a good job, and you just get caught holding the deck, a bad hand. It's hard to pivot from there, particularly because he wasn't beloved when he came in. He kind of gets the position, and then they're looking for fault, and they found that. And so I think he'll have difficulty. No problem with Jack Reed over there, but yeah, Rhode Island will be an interesting primary, at least.
And so to just add on to that, John Lynch, when he first was elected governor in New Hampshire, the state had several very bad floods, and he was giving out his personal cell phone number to people who were being impacted by these floods. His approval rating went up, and it stayed incredibly high for the rest of his terms. One of the most popular governors ever in America since we've been doing polling.
Those issues feel so personal, right? If you're stuck in the bridge traffic, you're going to remember that when you go to vote, even 6 months later.
I can hear the advertisements now. Stuck on the bridge? You know who to blame.
Exactly.
Well, it torpedoed Chris Christie's career here in New Jersey. So, yeah.
It
definitely,
write a book
it
on
definitely
it.
works.
Great. Well, we have a great question from the audience. Just a reminder to keep them coming if you have any questions for our panelists. One of our viewers asks, think there's any incumbent members of the House in New England in danger, and specifically any thoughts on Stephen Lynch here in Massachusetts?
Yeah, the linchpin is getting challenged again from the left. He's a conservative, he's a Democrat, but I think he's pro-life still. a former union worker. He's been challenged a couple of times, and he's been able to fend those off. We'll see if he's able to do that. I think there's a race in Connecticut where you're going to see, was it not the fifth, not Hayes, another
I think the
older
first
member.
Larson in the first.
Larson.
Yeah.
He's going to get challenged. So those two will be, somewhat interesting. And then we'll get into those primaries because, Moulton's district will be up. Pappas is open now, the second district of Maine. So we start to get into those races. But yeah, it's kind of a wide range of thoughts. Hard to imagine it shifting, though, this cycle.
If it does, it might be one Republican pickup, and that would be a long shot in my
I'm
view
thinking
right now.
maybe Maine's second
Yeah.
district in a ranked choice situation, which is a bit unique, and that could create the upset.
Yeah, I think any incumbent with a serious younger challenger who's in their 70s or even 80s has to be looking over their shoulder right now.
Well, they tried Richie Neal a couple years ago. It didn't work out too well here. So we'll see.
I think we have in mass, we have a record number of Democratic challengers this year, something like the most we've had in a decade at least, something like that. So really, I think kind of a test for where the electorate is leaning. I wonder how you all think about some of these really crowded open seat races we have. You mentioned the race for Seth Moulton's seat since he's looking to jump to the U.S. Senate this year. What's kind of a good shorthand to think about who may make it out of those races? What are voters looking for when they're evaluating these fresh faces?
The youth and energy. I think right now that's going to be the one unifying thing that's going on. And for Democrats, it's to get somebody who is reasonably electable, but even more importantly, who is not part of the establishment of the Democratic Party.
But these races get really complicated when there's 10, 12 candidates and also a ton of outside money. We've seen so many super PACs, whether they're AI super PACs, crypto super PACs, Jewish super PACs coming into these races. They really tilt the scales because they can spend millions of dollars when the local candidates are lucky to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it can really, and when you have races like this without ranked choice voting or without a 50% threshold for a runoff, you have candidates winning with 25, 29% of the vote. It keeps a lot more candidates in the race, and it makes it each candidate thinking they can get to the finish line if they only have to get to 25 or 27% of the vote in a 10 candidate field than to get to 50% of the vote in a 2 candidate race. So you're going to have candidates winning with very small percentages. And I think that's going to be a challenge to them in the future. When you only win your first race with 25 or 27% of the vote, it makes you look like a weaker candidate when you come around for re-election 2 years later.
And on top of that, overall turnouts can be anywhere from 20 to maybe 40% tops in these primaries. So it's a small group of people that are going to be deciding who's going to win.
I would just add in, it's about the money. So you can have 12 candidates, but if you don't have any money, no one's going to know of you. So you get the PACs, but that we're seeing around the country, people, just millionaires, billionaires jumping into races in Michigan and in Georgia, where California, where they can just pay, $100 million in ads. That would be a significant game changer in Maine or New Hampshire if somebody was to drop, $10 million directly into a race. So you do have the self-funding aspect of it, but overall, it usually dwindles itself down, and then we get to the debates, and that kind of cues the voters of who they're going to cue and jump on.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the self-funding because here in Mass, particularly on the Republican side, we have a lot of wealthy candidates, 3 candidates contributing some of their own money for the governor's race. John Deaton, expected to be the nominee again for U.S. Senate. He, of course, lost to Elizabeth Warren in her last re-election race. All 4 of those kind of top of the ticket Republican candidates here pouring their own money into these races. How do voters respond to that? I mean, is there an element of respecting people who've sort of built up these nice nest eggs for themselves? Is there suspicion of wealthier candidates? How do you expect that might play?
It's in their story. they got to tell a good story. And if it's the story is that they inherited money or they got that, but you can even see Tom Steyer's out in California trying to be a billionaire for regular people. And we see it down in these other races where these billionaires can come in and buy the race. Right now, we're in the Republican primary in Mass, so I don't think many people are even paying attention to these candidates. Um, but it will make an impact if they get on TV and they're sending text messages and communicating to people. They'll at least know of them. But it does open themselves up, particularly come the general election in a state like Massachusetts, to be attacked for being self-funded. And, I think Bernie gave us a good lesson in 2016 when he was able to say, I got, X amount of donations at $49 per person, 29, and you could have that low donor amount and show that type of enthusiasm for the candidacy. So I think it helps in that situation and to bandwagon that onto additional fundraising opportunities. But the self-funder is definitely a player that you have to be aware of because they can communicate to voters directly.
Yeah. All right. Not seeing any more questions from the chat, but just a reminder, we have some experts here, so I don't be shy. I'll just throw out a couple more, and then I'll kick it to you, Patrick, for some closing remarks. I'm just curious. We generally see the trend that turnout is lower in a midterm year than in a presidential election year. Any sense that that might change or shift this year, given the broader conversations around, international diplomacy and affordability, or should we expect to see that same trend hold?
I can see it being higher among Democrats, but
Yeah,
not really among Republicans. I think Republican primary turnout is going to be extremely low. There's not a lot of action, not a lot of enthusiasm there, but on the Democratic side, I think you can see it. And that's why some of these races we've been talking about, particularly the Plattner race and the Plattner Mills race, going to be pretty interesting to follow.
that's been pretty. I mean, there's been 5 states so far with primaries: Texas, North Carolina, Illinois, Arkansas, and Mississippi. Every state Democratic turnout is up 50 to 70% from the midterms in 2022, and Democrat and Republican primary turnout is flat. I think that's a pattern we're going to see just about everywhere: flat Republican primary turnout and significant, 40, 50, 60% increases in Democratic primary turnout.
And we saw that in those special elections in 2015, 2025, even in the Tennessee, whatever, 7th or 9th district race, where that turnout was the same as the midterm turnout. So generally, like we just saw in Jersey, that turnout was very low. That's what you're normally going to see. But as soon as that race in Tennessee became nationalized, turnout just went through the roof. So you can see that when people are aware that these elections are happening, they're going to come out. And who's going to come out, to Andy's point? It's the Democrats. They cut into that lead in Tennessee by 9 points or so. So even though they haven't necessarily won all these races, the Democrats, you can start to see a trend dating back to the previous, from 25 and continuing into these midterms, including Texas, where, that was a very competitive race with a huge turnout. And they came together very quickly. So that's going to be fun to watch.
Yeah, the Democrats just did the same thing in the Marjorie Taylor Greene open seat special. They cut a 30-point Trump district to a 12-point margin. I think you're going to see that in a lot of places.
That brings up, I think, a real interesting point about the importance of nationalizing your race, meaning that it's being covered in the national news. Because I think that the Emma, you probably know this as well as everybody else. Local newspapers, local media sources are not having the weight that they've done in the past. If more and more people are getting their news over the internet or from sources over the internet, they're going to national places. So the national coverage of these races is something that I think really brings a lot of enthusiasm to people that might not normally pay much attention, because now they're seeing it all of the time from every national source that they come across. Because one thing we do know about the national news, they like to cover each other's news. And that cycle updraft when you're getting national coverage of being the underdog, it really brings in a lot of money and a lot of enthusiasm, as you can see with every time the Democrats think they have a chance of winning Texas.
Right. Well, I'll use that as a great reminder to subscribe to your local newspaper. I'm partial to the Boston Globe, but whatever you prefer.
Yes.
And then maybe let's end on another question from the chat, sort of a meta one for some polling experts and pollsters here. Um, we know obviously there's been a lot of conversation in recent years about polls that end up being off, after election day. Can you just talk about sort of what those of us who are not in the industry should know to look for, how you can read a poll this early in the field, and kind of how we can know when to rely on a poll when it's credible? Do you think the industry is getting better?
Oh boy. We're in the midst of a paradigm shift in how we do election polling, similar to where we were in the 1960s and 70s, moving from in-person polling to telephone polling. And I have to say that we don't have any real best practices yet. We've got better practices and not so good practices. But we've got another 5+ years before we settle this thing out. You go to the APOR conference this year. I don't know how many panels are going to be yet, but I imagine there's going to be many, many panels about probability panels, other methods for collecting data. It's something we have to be cautious about, and I think that's all of us speaking here that are doing polling. We are much, much more cautious about what our polls are saying than are the media or the politicos that are reading them. And I think that a heavy dose of humility and suspicion about the numbers in polls, especially this far out in a primary cycle, is very healthy.
No, I would just add on that that's what we do. We study each election as a study. We learn from them. So in 2020, we were collecting data using a little bit of online and mostly IVR landlines, and that method had kind of faded out. And now by 22, we're using text messages. So now when we look at our sample, we're randomly selecting 30,000 people, and now we can get 900 completes through texting, and more people are comfortable taking a text poll than they were 5, 6 years ago. And so that evolution continues. Then you have these online panels that you have to continuously watch because panels go stale. And you have some panels that might get old quickly, and it's bad data. And that's very concerning. So what's nice is in our space, we're using the texting, the probability sampling, even IVR still, and we're looking at data that way. Then we're also collecting it through the online panels, looking at it that way. And then when I see certain polls that don't jive with our polls, I can see why there's differences. And generally, it's in the mode of data collection. So that's something that you need to keep an eye out for. And then the biggest thing, though, is give us the margin of error. There's a range of scores to a poll. And if we're outside the margin of error, then we are predicting that somebody is going to take that race. But generally, these races are within the poll's margin of error, in which case, that's all we're telling you is that we have a competitive race here. And that's how it should be watched by observers. Unfortunately, we look at it as an exact score, and then people, expect too much from, I think, what a poll can do.
Got it.
I think the one thing that everybody should pay attention to is probability versus non-probability sampling. To me, that there's no real substitute for for probability sampling. Just becomes a big convenience sample. And I always point back to the 1936 Literary Digest survey with 2 million responses, picking Alf Landon to beat FDR in that race. The law of large numbers does not really exist in polling. It's the methodology and the mathematical model that you have that actually allows you to generalize the results from a sample back to the population.
Great, great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your smart questions. And Patrick, I'll kick it to you to close us out.
Sure. Thank you, Emma, very much. And thanks, Spencer, Joe, and Andy for the great conversation today. I found it really interesting, and hopefully those who were watching us did as well. And I think there's still time to catch the end of the Red Sox game, too. So wrapping up just on time. Just want to remind everybody that this is part of the NEAAPOR webinar series. So do keep an eye out for additional webinars coming up in the summer and fall. NEAAPOR also has a social get-together coming up this summer, which we will send out some additional information on very shortly. And of course, be on the lookout for some of us at the upcoming APOR conference happening in LA in May. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks.